doesn't hear or needs repeated, please feel free to let me know. And Commander Runner and I have talked about this. We're not going to be offended related to it. He's perfectly competent to testify. It's just if there's issues with understanding, just let me know.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Minor, you know that the microphone is not for amplification, so you just got to have to keep your voice up. And if there is an issue, if you want to take a break, as we said earlier, we can do that.
Thank you, sir.
Proceed, sir.
Commander Runner, please introduce yourself to the board and give us a brief synopsis of your history in law enforcement.
Thank you. My name is Aaron Miner. I was employed for over 22 years with the city of Scottsdale. I was a police officer. I was a detective. I worked in property crimes. I was an undercover narcotics agent. I also worked with the DA task force. I was promoted to sergeant. Worked on the road and patrol. I worked as a gang investigations unit sergeant. I was an IA sergeant as well. Promoted to lieutenant, patrol lieutenant. I worked in special assignments, oversaw narcotics and intelligence. And then I was promoted to commander. I worked on patrol as a commander, and I worked in our special operations division, which included traffic, training, bikes, SROs, canines, and special events.
And then I'm going to get into the specifics, but before I get into the specifics, tell the board about what your thoughts are on integrity.
To me, it's not a difficult conversation. It's not a difficult concept. Integrity means, in layman's terms, in my terms, doing the right thing when no one's looking. Being truthful and honest, displaying professionalism, something that I've embodied to do and done for my entire career, my entire lifetime. And I think that the community expects that, the public expects that. That's what we sign up to do as police officers. That's my thought on integrity.
What about the concept of standing up for other employees? Is that something that's important to you?
It's always been important to me to stand up for people that can't stand up for themselves. Again, one of the reasons that people are drawn to law enforcement as a career is to protect those that can't be protected and stand up for those that can't stand up for themselves. That doesn't stop inside the department. So my philosophy, my personality is such that whether I do it knowingly or not, I stand up for people that may not stand up for themselves because I believe it's the right thing to do.
And you have a history of choosing to do the right thing even when it might be unpopular?
Yes,
Why?
definitely. I do it because it's the right thing. It's something that requires little effort to do what we've been told to do, what guidelines, what policies, what laws expect us to do. There are those that feel that certain entitlements come with doing certain behaviors. I tend to believe that we follow the rules, and if there's an exception to the rule, we make decisions. That's what people are promoted to do. That's what chiefs, that's what city managers, that's what people are promoted to do.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears and let's talk about your history with Chief Slavin. Did you guys maintain a professional relationship in your opinion?
Yes.
And do you think that he's, generally speaking, a competent supervisor?
Absolutely.
So before the board, there's been this characterization of a professional rivalry. Can you tell the board about what your thoughts are on that?
Well, you know, first of all, we worked together since I never worked for him, he never worked for me. It's kind of unique. Usually at some point you work for people you know for, I would say, close to 18 years. So we grew up in the department together, that's been talked about. Different assignments, we worked together as supervisor patrol sergeants. He was our SAU sergeant. I was, I believe, we worked together detectives in special assignment. Our paths crossed frequently, lieutenants and then as commanders as well. We enjoyed a good working relationship. We didn't always agree on everything, just like everybody doesn't. But we talked about those issues, operational concerns. He was, like I said, special assignment unit investigator and sergeant, as I was more on the investigation side. My career mirrored investigation. So We had the talks about things that we didn't see eye to eye on.
So eventually you both put in for the assistant chief position that Assistant Chief Slavin now has. Did you respect the fact that Chief Rodbell selected Chief Slavin for that position instead of you?
Yes.
Okay. Now, there was some testimony before about this meeting that happened in Chief Slavin's office between you and Chief Slavin. Do you recall that?
Yeah, I do.
So Chief Slavin talked to the board about that meeting. Is your memory of that meeting the same as what the board heard?
No, it's not.
So what happened at that meeting?
Well, I believe Chief Slavin was promoted in May or June of 2018. It was towards the end of, a couple months later, like September, August, September, I'll say, I don't remember the date. Another commander, senior commander to me, our senior commander, we were having a conversation, and he asked the question, how are things between you and Rich? I said, I don't know. I mean, I would assume they're fine. We were friends, we talked, we went to lunches. I mean, there was presumably no problem that was brought to my attention. That conversation allowed me, or I guess gave me the perception that there might be something wrong. Otherwise, why would you say it? So I called or made a meeting with, I can't remember, email, text, Chief Slavin, to have a sit down and talk. And my intention was put it on the table, find out whatever was a problem that was brought to my attention, to deal with it, and to make sure that he understood my point of view. So we did have that meeting. It was, like I said, my recollection would have been September of 2018. I think it was categorized earlier by Chief Slavin as February of, I would guess he meant 2019. So I met with him in his office at headquarters. I said, hey, I was asked how things are. I think they're good. What's up? And he said, I don't think that you're happy I got promoted and that you didn't thank me. And I was taken back. I said, well, if that's how you felt, why didn't you say something? That was my first response. This is hard. So we had that conversation about, why wouldn't you tell me? We're friends. And he said he was told not to tell me because he was the reason for my being upset and being upset. I said, this is ridiculous. So we talked. I said, congratulations, you're well deserving. Yes, I was upset I didn't get promoted. I don't think that's unusual, but it has no bearing on our relationship and his qualifications to be an assistant chief. We talked about our families. I'm familiar with his sons. Matter of fact, help him to understand education and how his son can get a job in education, regardless. We more or less hugged it out at the end. I guess is a colloquial term. And ever since then, or I'm sorry, not ever since, but after that, we enjoyed meetings and lunches and talks. I mean, to me, I left the meeting that things were handled. He understood where I was coming from, and I understood where he was coming from.
So you literally hugged at the end of the meeting?
I literally hugged it out, like, I'm sorry it came to this. There's no reason that he can't come to me or vice versa with the problem, with the concern, because we've been friends for, at that time, I can't remember when he was hired. I was hired in 97. He was like late 90s, maybe 2000. So it's been 18 years.
And then after that meeting, up until the meeting where the patrol operations comment was made, you met with Chief Slavin for lunch or just got together with him on about a weekly basis. Is that accurate?
I can say without a doubt, other than vacations, sick time, things that take us away from work, we met twice a week for staff and for a commander's meeting. He was present. And it was a routine of most commanders to go and visit, it's a chance to get FaceTime or to talk or get some clarification on issues with superior officers before those meetings. So I routinely met with Chief Slavin for that clarification, that operational direction, and then also lunches and coffees and just general conversation about work, operations, and occasionally about what's going on in our personal lives.
Now, there was some characterization potentially about that meeting that at the end of it, that you were essentially insubordinate or not answering his questions, and he threw you out of his office, basically.
Objection to the state's testimony. Although I think the record-
Speak up.
I object to the question, the premise of the question misstates testimony, but with.
Mr. Slavin, so we don't have to go back and look at the record, why don't you ask him if he remembers that conversation, that testimony?
Sure. Do you remember the conversation that Chief Slavin gave on, was it Thursday? Related to how that meeting ended?
Verbatim, but the gist was that I was not accepting of his promotion and that I was not accepting of the fact that I said or did something.
Okay. At that meeting, if at any point you were either insubordinate or disrespectful, would you or he have needed to notify your supervisor?
Yeah, I mean, by definition and by policy, and Chief Bob's office is right next door, so I would expect that to occur. That was the case with that.
Okay. Now, let's fast forward. The board has heard from multiple people about the command staff meeting, but specifically, what comments do you remember Chief Slavin making, and then what was your reaction?
The comments first was, it was characterized as trying to identify the name of a newspaper after training or during a training, and I believe it was a French paper it was talked about. He said, well, was it gay? And then they were trying to figure out who the person was. Charlie Hebdo was eventually disclosed as by Tommy Myers, who was at the training. And when Lieutenant Myers said, the name is Charlie Hebdo, he said, what, are you gay? And those were the two comments that were made. I forgot the second part of that question.
Well, then what was your reaction to that?
I was immediately, I was offended. I couldn't believe I heard that. It goes against everything that I've learned, that I stand for, and it was offensive. I couldn't believe I heard it.
Did you believe that it was misconduct for Chief Slavin to say that?
Yes, I do.
So then, what do the rules in Scottsdale require if you witness misconduct?
If you witness misconduct, you do one of two things. Well, to bring it to your boss, to move it up the chain, to tell that this conduct was offensive, and that explain that is the policy of the department. It goes further as a supervisor at times to notify HR, and that would necessitate an immediate and complete investigation of the misconduct that's alleged. So that's how I understand misconduct to be dealt with.
And then you learned at the same time that Lieutenant Bonnet heard the same thing, right?
Yeah, he was in the room.
And did he also say that this was misconduct and violated the policies?
Yeah, he did.
Now, based off of your prior experience in IA, did you believe that an investigation would be conducted?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to move forward to talk about the email that Chief Slavin sent out related to the comments that were made. Did you think that this was unusual, this email?
Yeah. It was unusual because I'd never seen an email like that before. It was unusual.
Did you think that this was Chief Slavin taking accountability or accepting accountability for his actions?
I think it was Chief Slavin apologizing. I don't think it had anything to do with accountability, or in my mind recognizing that the level of his misconduct is judged by other people.
Did you think that his comments were more significant than an inappropriate joke?
Yes.
Why?
Because he was talking about a community that, the LGBTQ community, he was making jokes about it. as it was funny, was intolerant to any type of difference.
Was what Chief Slavin said homophobic in your opinion?
The joke was homophobic, yes.
Okay. And then in your experience with IA and then just generally in the Scottsdale Police Department, does an email take the place of a formal investigation?
That's why I said it was unusual. I'd never seen it before, so no, it does not take the place of a formal investigation.
Okay. And then after that email came out, you actually met with Chief Slavin, right?
I did.
Okay. Why did you meet with him?
I wanted to hear it from him out of the context of a group or an email or something other. We've known each other for a long time, so I wanted to tell him. It was my obligation to tell him as a friend, and hey, what's going on? That missed the mark. I was shocked that it happened, and please explain. So that was my intention, was to get him away from a group. Not that we had to do that, but to have a friend-to-friend, man-to-man conversation about what had occurred.
Okay. Is it your recollection that Chief Slavin testified in this hearing that he knew that you were offended when he talked to you?
Yes, he believed I was.
Okay. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
When you talked to Chief Slavin, do you think that you were also standing up for Lieutenant Bonnet and any other offended members of the Scottsdale Police Department?
I think people would, Lieutenant Bonnet or others that have been talked about, would maybe appreciate the fact that I was doing that. But that was not my obligation to those people. My obligation was to take the information to my boss and follow the AR. My intent of talking to Assistant Chief Slavin was more of a, handling something on the lowest level. That was, to me, the lowest level. That's what I've been trying to do.
When you talked to him, did you feel like he understood the significance of derogatory statements regarding sexual orientation?
No, I do not.
Okay, why do you say that?
Well, he said he didn't remember saying it, first of all. Very troubling to me, and I think anybody that would hear that you don't recognize that those comments are offensive, period. Second of all, I told him I was shocked, and he said, yeah, I guess I can't let my hair down. Which tells me that he got caught. You can't do that in that setting. Oh no, I guess I did it, and I thought it would be okay. That's what that meant to me. And I was appalled by it internally. I felt like that was enough. That to me meant that, what are you saying about me when I'm not around? That's what that means. What are you saying about others specifically, just because they're not there and they're not okay with it? That's what that means to me.
So fast forward, eventually you met with and you talked with Chief Pop, correct?
Yes.
And why did you do that?
Well, I talked to him, it's been said, I called and I emailed, I talked to him in person. He was out of town, and he was my boss, so it was not unusual for me to talk to him on a weekly, if not daily basis about something that was happening in my chain of command, which affected him. In this case, I called him knowing he was out of town. I believe he was out of town, and we talked once or twice. Well, it would have been once, and then he was back after the weekend. So this happened on Thursday. I talked to him Friday after I talked to Rich, or Chief Slavin, and then the following Monday or Tuesday we met in person to discuss it. And the reason was I needed to tell him about what happened. That was my job to do that. And number two, I wanted him to understand how it impacted me, and then kind of related to the meeting, there was a change in direction of that meeting, and I didn't think he knew because he never told me about it. So there was a lot of reasons to talk to him, and that's why I called him and followed him face to face.
Also, did you think you were required by policy to report?
Yeah, that's what I said. That is a big part of it, to say, I know this is how I feel, this is how my subordinate feels. I have to move forward.
And you're referring to the fact that you notified him that Lieutenant Bonnet
Yes.
also reported misconduct?
Sorry, yes.
Did you think that this meeting would have triggered an internal misconduct investigation once Chief Pop reported the information to Chief Rodbell?
Yes, I do.
Were you told of any developments after your meeting with Chief Pop?
Yeah, it was, the first time we met was, I don't know if it was Monday or Tuesday of the following week, so, 4 days after type of thing. He said the Chief's handled it. That was how it was characterized to me. First was, let me look into it, then was Chief's handled it.
Okay. What did you take that to mean?
Well, the first time I wanted to let him know, like, this is more than, to me, again, this is more than a homophobic joke in a meeting. This represents a larger issue of intolerance, and that we're tolerating bad behavior, misconduct, and that not doing anything might actually tell people it's okay to do that. That was my concern.
You told that to Chief Pop?
Yes, I did, and that was, I'm sorry, that was characterized as, there was, I believe the IA investigator said that I said, I shouldn't have to tell why I was offended. This is absolutely true, I said that. However, in context, I said, I shouldn't have to because it talks about intolerance, period. It talks about defense, period. I shouldn't have to just say that I have a family member who's gay, or I'm gay, or a good friend of mine. It has no bearing onto whether or not it's offensive or not. So that was the context. So yes, I did follow up with him to say, hey, there's a little bit more information, like this is the impacts it's having on me, it's having on Bob, like, is this it, we're done? And he said, again, the chief has handled it, or handled. In other words, in my mind, we're done. I mean, I did what I was obligated to do by statute, or I'm sorry, by policy and guideline. I told him personally what it meant to me. He's a sergeant, or a chief. We started, he was my first sergeant, so we'd worked together I'd worked for him on and off for, I'd say, 15 out of 22 years, so our entire career, I worked for him. So we have a personal relationship, and I wanted to know personally, like, this is important to me. And at that point, after a couple, 2 or 3 conversations, it was my impression it wasn't going to go anywhere. Nothing was going to be changed.
So let's talk about that. During this time period between when you reported to Chief Pop and he said Rod Bell's handling it, and then when you end up getting interviewed by Sergeant Lewis, did you have conversations with other members of the Scottsdale Police Department who talked about being offended?
I did.
Tell me about that.
Well, I mean, so May 10th, which would have been after the comments were made, I was in a new hire interview process with Commander LeDuc and a civilian manager. I don't remember who, I know who it could have been, I don't remember who was there. I don't know that based on your question. I told him the apology email came out, was emailed out, and both of us were recipients. And I told him, I said, I need to go talk to him, about these comments. I can't believe they're made, something to that effect. And he said, yeah, yeah, you should. Yes, go talk to him, or he supported that. And that was it was messed up how it was said or what was said. I don't remember without looking at the full transcript or whatever. And so I did. So that was like the day after. Another one that sticks out in my mind is I had a supervisor meeting. Understand my supervisor meetings aren't just for sergeants and lieutenants, like anybody wants to go. If you want to be an OIC or you want to be a promote, like come and listen to what we're talking about. There's nothing that can't be shared. And so there was, and I say that only because it was a large group. It's probably 25, 30 people in our division or District 1 community room. And an employee asked, this was probably in mid-June, that time frame, so I know it was after the comments, before my interview. Sergeant asked the question, do you know, did Chief Slavin make gay jokes in a meeting, their operational meeting or staff meeting? He said in a meeting. And I said, yeah, he did. I was there. I mean, I can't say he didn't, he absolutely did. Well, what's being done about it? I said, I was told that Chief Rod Bell's handling it. If you have any questions, you can go talk to him. So that was another one. Lieutenant Cabrera and I were talking about a training we had attended and I don't have the date, but I know it's in the binders, for fair and impartial policing, which is, for lack of better terms, it's implicit bias training is what it is. And we're talking about that, and, the fact that these comments are exactly what we're talking about in the training. It's explicit, not implicit, but we're talking about it. And how are we going to deal with this? Because we're rolling out a training, and how do you deal with someone of that stature and organization making those comments? Like, how do you bring that out in training? It makes it difficult. I got asked questions by some of my direct reports. What happened? Did he really say it? And so my answer was yes. He did say it. As far as what's happening, I made the appropriate requests and made the appropriate, followed the guidelines and policies, and as far as I know, it's being handled.
So is it fair to say that by the time Sergeant Lewis began his investigation, you believe that many other members of the Scottsdale Police Department were potentially prepared to give a statement about the offensive comments?
Yes, I believe that there were more people by the time I got interviewed in late June by Sergeant Lewis that I had conversation with and believed were offended.
Okay. Now, let's talk about the interview with Sergeant Lewis that happened weeks later. Although it was late, did you believe that this was the appropriate way to address Chief Slavin's misconduct?
Yeah, I thought this should have happened, shortly after the event. And I was actually surprised that we were even having the investigation.
Now, when you were an IA, had you conducted AR 333 investigation?
I have.
Did you think that Sergeant Lewis was going to conduct a formal interview?
I believe he should. I mean, that's the only interview there is.
Okay. Would you characterize your interview as a traditional IA interview, or did it seem different for you?
It seemed it seemed different. It was not what I would expect nor have conducted for this type of investigation.
Okay. During your interview, did you provide Sergeant Lewis with accurate information about the statements that were made by Chief Slavin?
Yes, I did.
But during that interview, did Sergeant Lewis quickly try to characterize the comments of Chief Slavin as a joke?
Yeah, he did.
What was your response to that?
I thought he was trying to make a joke. It wasn't funny, and it was at face value offensive. I think was the term he used.
Okay. Now, since words matter, right? You said on its face offensive at the time of your interview, but today you said at face value offensive. Did you mean them to be the same thing?
Yeah, like I said, I think, yes.
Okay. And you also disclosed to Sergeant Lewis that you confronted Chief Slavin about the comments that Chief Slavin had made, right?
I did.
Okay. And you told him that you told Chief Slavin that you were shocked, right?
Yes.
Now, first, Sergeant Lewis asked you if you knew of anyone who was directly offended. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
So, you told him not specifically and told him there was an uncomfortable, laughish moment after the comments were made. Do you recall that?
Yeah.
Why?
Should misstates testimony, but I think it can.
So, Kenny,
Apologies. I object you did not read the transcript accurately, but I'll let it speak for itself.
why don't you ask the question again? Can you speak up also?
Sure. So, as part of your response to one of the times where you asked if you knew of anyone who was directly offended, part of your response was you told them not specifically, correct?
Correct.
Now, at that point, did Sergeant Lewis ask you who was uncomfortable or who laughed?
No.
Okay. And then Sergeant Lewis again chose the term directly offended a second time when he asked you about who he should talk to first, correct?
Counsel, to be fair, if you read the transcript, it says, do you know anyone who's directly, and I'm doing this by memory, directly offended? He responded, so I know who to talk to next. So it was sort of the answer in between Detective Lieutenant Lewis was still asking, Sergeant Lewis still asking the question.
So there was some crosstalk during that?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. And I mean, I would have to look now at the actual transcript or have it read to me. I mean, but he was telling me that he was going to interview anybody else that he needs to talk to.
Okay. So what was your understanding, tell the board what your understanding of the term directly offended was?
Well, it was, I'm being characterized as being analytical and stoic and, you know, somewhat pessimistic, I guess. And in that analytical part of my brain, directly offended is different than offended. I mean, why would you use directly? And so it was, to me, and to this day, is still a two-part question. I mean, it's two words. One, directed. Was it directed at a specific person? And two, was that person offended? I don't see it really any other way. That was how I interpreted the question.
Okay, so then based off of that, the only person that could have been directly offended was Lieutenant Myers?
Yes,
Why do you say that?
because the comment you gave was directed to Lieutenant Myers, and he answered with the person that everybody couldn't remember. And he kind of laughed. He didn't seem offended to me. He didn't stand up and leave the room. He didn't say, "Oh my gosh, you said that." He didn't say anything. So to me, he wasn't offended.
Okay. And you talked earlier about your interpretation of the interview. Did you think that Sergeant Lewis was trying to minimize misconduct?
Yeah, I do.
Why?
I think the comments rose to the level of Part 1 investigation. And by talking, Part 1 AR 3, I should say, and by focusing on the joking part is, I guess, hallmarks is the first word that comes to mind for Part 2, is inappropriate language, horseplay, jokes, memes, things like that that would be at a lesser level than Part 1 or making statements to an individual. Within the city, in my experience, both IA and as a supervisor, there is a heavier weight, generally speaking, for Part 1 than a Part 2.
Did this interview also lack the structure that you and IA investigators typically have?
Yeah, it lacked the structure based on my IA experience as well as an investigator for over 10 years.
Okay. Did you think that this interview lacked open-ended questions to gain additional information?
Yeah, I think it did.
Okay. Did you use this interview as like a opportunity to try to attack Chief Slavin?
No,
Why not?
I had already talked to my boss about my concern. I was asked very specific questions. I answered them. I had nothing to attack Chief Slavin. I didn't even talk to him about it.
Okay. Now, after the interview was done, after that went off tape, did you tell the investigators that there was additional information that they might want to consider?
Yeah, I asked specifically to go back on tape because I said, do you want to know about what information I told Pop and that, you know, what I believed to be happening and how it was being handled? Do you want to go on tape and talk about it? Like go back on tape, meaning look back on the record.
And why did you ask that?
Because I felt the questions I was asked were not sufficient enough to look at the entirety of the interactions that occurred.
Okay. So do you think that Sergeant Lewis missed some of the facts that could relate to misconduct by other people at the department?
I believe, yes.
Okay. But it's up to him to decide whether he wants to go back on tape or not,
It
correct?
is.
Okay. Now, there was a supplemental email that you sent later on, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Was this designed to address Chief Slavin's lack of contrition?
It was designed to, I guess I don't understand. I mean, my design was to make sure I was, you know, complete in that specific question about, you know, a conversation with Chief Slavin.
Okay. And was this for you to make a distinction between him being caught versus him being sorry for misconduct?
I guess I don't understand between being caught. Say it one more time.
Was it your desire to tell the investigators that you wanted them to know that Chief Slavin felt that he was caught doing something wrong as opposed to being sorry for the misconduct?
Yes.
Okay. Now, that email didn't have any information about your meeting that you had with Chief Pop and the reports that you made. Why didn't you include that in that email at that point?
Chief Pop knew about it. I don't think, I wasn't asked about it. I was specific to the question I was asked during the interview. I didn't think it was relevant to that email.
And at that point, you'd already offered to go back on tape to actually talk about the reporting and how Chief Rodbell had handled it, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, fast forward months later. Actually, no, let's talk about the context here. So, since that, we talked earlier about your relationship with Chief Slavin and how you guys had been meeting up about once a week and having informal lunch. Since you actually made that misconduct report to Chief Pop about Chief Slavin's comments, did your relationship with Chief Slavin change during that time period?
Well, based on what I've heard last week, obviously it did. Not on any of my part, from my perspective. But in a meeting with my boss, Chief Pop, we're talking about, I don't remember, but he asked a question, like, how are things with you and Rich? I'm like, okay, you're the second person in my lifetime that asked me that, so, like, I'll bite what? What's the problem? I mean, things were fine up until he made the comments and I addressed them. I think most people would take exception to the fact that someone came and said, basically called them out. I said, well, other than that, like, there's no issue. He says, okay, well, you know, the rumor is, and that's where we got into what was characterized as what I was doing. I said that he told me, Chief Pop told me, the rumor was that I wanted his job. That's why I applied for it. So yes, I did want his job. I was after his pension, and that I was saying disparaging remarks about him. I said, this is absolutely not true. 100% not true. Haven't done it. Was I upset I didn't get the job? Yes, I applied for a job, I didn't get it. This is now a year later. Moving forward. So I said, I didn't say, he said, well, it sounds like some rumors and gossip and whatnot. I said, yeah, what would I stand to gain by doing any of that? That's ridiculous. And so that is the conversation we had, and that was the next time that we talked about this supposed, just alleged rumor and gossip that I was doing.
Okay. Did you ever lie to Chief Pop about any conversations that you had?
No, absolutely not.
Okay. So fast forward again, you were called to a meeting with Chief Rodbell and Chief Gandara. Were you given a reason for this meeting?
I believed I was going to talk about projects that I was working on that I was asked about.
Okay. Well, instead, when you got there, you were provided with transcripts from your IA interview and from Lieutenant Bonnet's interview, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
At that point, would it have been appropriate for you to sit there and say, like, hey, Chief, this is the explanation for why these transcripts don't match up, or like, here's what I was thinking at the time?
No, I don't think it would have been appropriate for him to say that.
Why not?
Well, in my mind, he believes he had alleged misconduct. He told me he talked to his boss, city manager, HR, legal, and so he essentially believed this investigation moving forward, that would have been a violation of the peace officer code of rights.
Okay. And nobody asked you in that meeting to explain yourself related to those comments, correct?
No one asked me that.
What was your understanding of the purpose of that meeting? What did you think it was about?
Pretty straightforward. Here's what we have against you. You can resign or you can go fight it with IA.
Okay. And what was your choice?
My choice was obvious. I was going to explain to IA what I had done and why the concern was there, as best of my knowledge.
Okay. Mary Cronin later characterized this meeting in her investigation as him giving you as Chief Rodbell giving you an opportunity to clarify your answers. Is that appropriate?
No, that's not what happened. That's not how I remember the meeting at all.
Okay. So after that meeting, you eventually have a meeting with Chief Pop prior to your IA interview, correct?
Yes.
Okay, tell me about that meeting. What did Chief Pop explain to you?
So we met at probably the coffee shop, convenient for both of us. And I told him what what had happened, that I met with Chief Robel and Chief Kintara, and that I was, completely floored, and it was obvious to me what the two options were: resign or fight. I mean, that was pretty much it. And he literally said, "I know you're a fighter. I know that in you to stand up and be a fighter," is what he said. He said, "I want you to know what you're, in his mind, what's going on." He prefaced by saying that he knew that conversation was going to occur, that he was told the day before, I shouldn't say I knew, he was told before the meeting it was going to occur, and that he knew what was being alleged. So I said, okay, and so the talk was, here, if you resign, you will get your medical time paid out, your medical bank, which there's some policies and rules about how much, 50% of this, 100% of that. It was roughly $70,000 was my medical, my bank. If I retired, or resigned, I should say, I would be afforded that amount of money into a health savings account, and that the chief would move forward with a AZ Post investigation. So that was option one, as I saw it. And he said, remember, if you fight this, Chief Robel is on the AZ Post hearing. Although he'll recuse himself, he'll be obligated to bring this case forward. And I said, well, he thinks that a lot. I don't see the difference between a case and no case. And we talked about that. And bottom line is, he said, and if you do decide to fight it with IA, you won't get your money. You won't get this health savings account funded because because that's the rule. Like, if you end up getting terminated, that would not happen. I said, I didn't lie. That is a large sum of money, but it's not worth it because I didn't lie. I'm not taking a plea on this. And that was our conversation. He said, think about it, talk to your attorney, talk to your family. I would hate to see you make a decision when you just have to clarify this one or two words or this one idea. And he obviously didn't say it. He didn't say what I think was in the transcript at the time, but he wanted me to know this was clarifying a specific incident. So that's how I characterized that meeting and how I remember it.
So then, moving forward, what did you, prior to your going in for your interview, after you made the decision to go forward, you prepared a presentation for Sergeant Lewis and gave it to him prior to your interview, right?
Yes, I did.
Why'd you do that?
Well, I didn't have a problem with my interview. I didn't lie in my interview in June. I didn't lie in any interview for that matter. So I was confused as to what was being characterized as misconduct and integrity. And looking at the transcripts I was given and highlighted from Chief Robel, it was clear to me that, and then talking to Chief Pop, it was clear they were focusing, that IA was focusing on this idea around offense. And specifically, the thing that jumped out to me was this directly offended. If no one else was asked that question in the however many interviews I did, I was the only person that was really asked about someone else being offended. So I prepared my statement prior to, because it was everything I knew before being asked any further questions and being able to deduce what it is what they were focusing on.
Okay. Did you tell them that you thought that this investigation was retaliatory?
I did.
Why did you feel that way?
Because I had immediately gone to Chief Slavin about the comments he made. I brought it to my boss. It was handled before any of this could even take place, which was odd to me. And then there were so many mistakes with the investigation that if the attempt was to do a full, complete investigation, these things would have been done. Why am I facing this level of scrutiny after I brought forward information, attempted to give additional information, and now I'm being told that my career is going to potentially end over this investigation, this new integrity investigation.
Okay. And during in your presentation, you listed, I think, 12 employees, give or take, who talked to you about Chief Slavin's comments, and you provided a brief synopsis about the nature of those conversations that you had. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. And then you said that none of them in particular stood out to you, and that's been talked about quite a bit in other people's testimony. Why did you say that?
Again, I think that's a simple explanation or way to characterize it, I guess, based on what I've heard, is that at the time of being interviewed, 5 or 6 weeks, whatever the time frame is after the incident occurred, I had talked to 10 to 12 people, so they were all offended. Like, nobody in that context stood out as being offended or not. They were all offended. As to the level of offense, I didn't ask and couldn't tell. I don't know what they, at the time, I obviously didn't know what they said to the IA sergeants, which is completely different than if you would have asked me I would have been asked by an IA sergeant May 10th or May 14th, shortly after the incident, because the only person that came to me was Lieutenant Bonnet, and that would have been remarkable in its own terms. It's just one person. It's not 1 of 10. It's 1 of 1.
Okay. And I mean, you said, and I don't want to like try to hold you down on time frames because then you're being